had always prided myself on being what most people would consider a good neighbor, perhaps even an exemplary one. A quiet cornerstone of the peaceful, leafy suburban enclave that my family and I called home on the idyllic Maple Street. It wasn't an effort born of obligation, but a genuine enjoyment of community, a belief in the simple everyday kindnesses that weave the fabric of a contented life. I was the one who instinctively helped Mrs. Henderson, the elderly widow at the end of the block, carry her heavy groceries up the porch steps, the one whose front yard was a tidy, cheerful testament to patient weekend efforts with pruning shears and a well-loved trowel. I made it a point, a small daily ritual, to always offer a warm, genuine smile and a friendly, "Good morning," or "Lovely day, isn't it?" to everyone I encountered during my morning walks with Buster, our aging but still enthusiastic golden retriever. But there was one neighbor, Mrs. Eleanor Wheeler, who resided 2 houses down in a meticulously kept, if somewhat stark and imposing gray colonial, who never seemed to reciprocate my warmth, whose very presence often felt like a small, localized cold front on an otherwise sunny day. At first, for many months, even a year, perhaps, I dismissed her coolness as mere shyness, a reserved nature, or perhaps the understandable stress of settling into a new community. People are different, I told myself. Not everyone is naturally effusive. However, as time wore on, the whispers started insidious and persistent, like a noxious invasive weed taking root in the otherwise well-tended garden of our peaceful community. They were harsh, cutting words often delivered with a sigh of feigned concern or a knowing, pitying glance. Insidious rumors about my family, about my parenting choices, about my very character. And all said, I soon and painfully learned right behind my back, often originating from, or significantly amplified by, Mrs. Wheeler herself. I tried with all my might to ignore it, to rise above the petty, unfounded negativity, to tell myself that her opinions didn't matter, that what mattered was the truth of who I was. But it hurt. It hurt deeply, a dull, persistent ache of confusion, frustration, and a profound sense of betrayal. Why me? What had I ever done to warrant such disdain? And then, when my own family unexpectedly found ourselves navigating a particularly rough, uncertain patch, a period of significant financial strain and the accompanying emotional turmoil, I realized with a strange, almost startling clarity that sometimes life, in its infinite, often ironic wisdom, presents you with the most unexpected and perhaps the most perfect opportunity, an opportunity to repay insidious negativity. Not with bitterness, not with reciprocal malice, but with an act of profound disarming and wholly unmerited kindness. So when Mrs. Eleanor Wheeler and her seemingly perfect, untouchable family suddenly catastrophically fell on unimaginably hard times, I knew with a certainty that resonated deep within the core of my being, it was my time to do the one thing that would change everything between us. Everything within our small community, and perhaps even something within myself. I would help them, and in doing so it would force them and perhaps others who had so readily listened to her whispers to see who I truly was, and more importantly, who they had allowed themselves to become all along. My name is Martha Evans. For 15 idyllic years, my husband Tom, a kind, steady architect with a gentle smile and an even gentler soul, and our 2 wonderful children. Emily, a bright, thoughtful 16-year-old, and young Ben, a boisterous, football-loving 12-year-old, had lived a relatively contented, blessedly ordinary life in our well-kept sunshine-yellow 2-story house on Maple Street. Our neighborhood was the kind of picture-perfect, tree-lined suburban community often depicted perhaps a little nostalgically in feel-good family movies. We had annual block parties in the summer, complete with slightly burnt hot dogs and fiercely competitive 3-legged races. We shared snowblowing duties in the harsh New England winters, neighbors helping neighbors dig out after a blizzard. There was a genuine, if sometimes understated sense of camaraderie, of looking out for one another. I've always believed deeply in the power of community, in the simple, often unacknowledged decencies of neighborly kindness. It wasn't something I did for show or out of a sense of obligation. I genuinely enjoyed it. I was the one who instinctively organized the annual Maple Street charity bake sale for the local children's hospital, a tradition I'd started a decade ago. I was the one neighbors often called first when they needed someone to look after their pets or water their plants while they were on vacation. I was the one who always seemed to have an extra cup of sugar, a spare egg, or more importantly, a sympathetic ear, and a comforting cup of tea to lend to a neighbor going through a tough time. I wasn't seeking accolades or neighborhood sainthood. I simply believed that this was how decent human beings behaved, how strong, resilient communities were built and maintained one small act of kindness at a time. But then there was the Wheeler family. Eleanor and David Wheeler and their two impeccably dressed, almost unnervingly quiet teenage children, a boy and a girl whose names I rarely heard spoken. They had moved into the imposing gray colonial at the end of our cul-de-sac about 5 years prior, arriving with a fleet of expensive moving vans and an air of distinct, almost frosty detachment. From the very beginning, Eleanor Wheeler had exuded an aura of something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It wasn't outright hostility, not in those early days. It was more a cool, appraising distance, a subtle but persistent sense of judgment that seemed to emanate from her like a faint, unpleasant perfume. While other long-standing neighbors would stop for a leisurely chat when I was out tending my prize-winning roses or wave enthusiastically from their cars as they drove by, Mrs. Wheeler would offer at best a curt, almost imperceptible nod. Her lips pressed into a thin, unyielding, and perpetually unsmiling line. Her eyes, a pale, washed-out blue that seemed to hold no warmth, often seemed to skim over me as if I were a slightly distasteful piece of scenery she was unfortunately forced to endure on her daily brisk walks. I tried, of course, as was my nature. Shortly after they moved in, I baked them one of my signature apple pies, still warm from the oven, a welcoming gesture I extended to all new arrivals on Maple Street. It was received with a polite but undeniably frigid "Thank you, Mrs. Evans" at their imposing front doorstep, the door closing a little too quickly for comfort, before I could even offer a proper welcome or an invitation for coffee. I invited their children, whose names I eventually learned were Thomas and Olivia, to Emily and Ben's subsequent birthday parties. They always had meticulously explained, but ultimately vague prior engagements. My consistently friendly "Good morning, Eleanor," as she retrieved her perfectly aligned morning paper, was often met with a mumbled, barely audible response. Sometimes just the rustle of her newspaper as she retreated further onto her shaded porch swing, a clear signal that no further interaction was desired. I told myself, as I often did in such situations, not to take it personally. Perhaps she was intensely private, a personality trait I could respect. Perhaps she was struggling with something unseen, a hidden sorrow or stress that made social niceties difficult. I resolved with a sigh to simply continue being myself, friendly, open, and helpful to all, including if the opportunity ever arose, the enigmatic Mrs. Wheeler. I wouldn't let one neighbor's coolness dampen my spirits or change my fundamental approach to community living. The whispers, however, began insidiously about a year or so after the Wheelers had settled in, like a slow-acting poison seeping into the wellspring of our neighborhood's generally good-natured gossip. At first, they were just faint, disconnected murmurs easily dismissed as isolated incidents of misunderstanding, or perhaps even my own oversensitivity. I'd overhear a slightly odd, ambiguous comment from another neighbor Betty at the checkout line in the local grocery store. "Oh, Martha, I heard you're practically running the poor Miller household down the street now with all the tireless help you give them since Mr. Miller fell ill. So wonderfully generous of you, or perhaps some might say a bit much." A comment that left me feeling vaguely uncomfortable, a strange mixture of praised and subtly criticized. Then the remarks became more direct, though still often couched in the guise of concerned observation. Another neighbor, Susan, a generally kind and sensible woman with whom I'd shared many coffees and school event planning sessions, hesitantly mentioned one day during one of our chats Eleanor Wheeler was saying, "Well, she wasn't being critical exactly, more observant, I suppose. But she was just wondering aloud at the last book club meeting how you managed to keep your house so picture perfect and volunteer for absolutely everything, almost as if you have something to prove, or perhaps, as she put it, far too much idle time on your hands for a woman with a working husband and 2 children." The words, though, delivered with Susan's clear attempt at neutrality and a touch of her own discomfort stung deeply. This wasn't just Mrs. Wheeler's personal passive coldness anymore. This was active, if subtle, character assassination. She was actively, albeit cleverly, trying to poison my reputation within the community I cherished, a community where I had always felt accepted and valued. She was meticulously painting my genuine desire to be helpful, my natural inclination towards organization and community involvement, my joy in creating a welcoming home as something performative, something disingenuous, something suspicious. The insidious narrative she was carefully, skillfully spinning, I began to realize, was that I was not good enough somehow for this idyllic neighborhood, that my very presence, my very way of being, my cheerful and capable demeanor was an affront to her sensibilities, a silent judgment on her own, perhaps less fulfilled existence. These carefully planted seeds of doubt, these backhanded compliments and veiled criticisms like tiny venomous darts began to find their mark. I started to notice a slight, almost imperceptible cooling in some of my other neighbors' demeanors, a new hesitancy in their eyes where once there was open warmth, a subtle shift in the ease of our conversations. It was a deeply unsettling, profoundly isolating feeling. I was being judged and clearly found wanting based on the malicious, artfully delivered whispers of one woman. I tried to confront the hurt, the anger, the bewilderment mostly in the quiet of my own heart, in late-night whispered conversations with Tom, who in his loving, pragmatic way advised me to simply ignore her, that some people are just miserable Martha and want to make everyone else miserable too. I tried to rise above it to tell myself that true friends, true neighbors would see my character, would know the truth of who I was. But the barbs unfortunately still found their mark, leaving small, festering wounds on my spirit. Then, about a year ago, our own usually stable family life faced an unexpected and deeply challenging period. Tom, my kind, steady, and incredibly hard-working husband, an architect with a small, well-respected local firm, was suddenly, devastatingly laid off. His firm, like many others, had been hit hard by a sharp, unforeseen economic downturn, and they had been forced to make drastic cuts. The financial strain on our family was immense and almost immediate. We had savings, of course, a rainy day fund we'd diligently contributed to over the years. But with two growing children, Emily on the cusp of looking at colleges and young Ben with his endless appetite and outgrown soccer cleats, mortgage car payments and the relentlessly rising cost of living, those savings began to dwindle at an alarming, terrifying rate. The stress within our home became a palpable entity, a constant, unwelcome guest. Tom, a proud and capable man, was understandably devastated by the job loss, his confidence deeply shaken. He spent his days tirelessly searching for new employment in a saturated market, his frustration mounting with each polite rejection, each unanswered application. I, in turn, took on extra shifts at the local library where I worked part-time, my quiet sanctuary now also a source of much-needed income. I ramped up production of my handmade quilts, spending late nights hunched over my sewing machine, my fingers aching, then selling them at local craft fairs on weekends, trying desperately with every stitch, with every sale, to bridge the ever-widening financial gap. We had to cut back on everything, the little luxuries we'd once taken for granted, the children's extracurricular activities, even our weekly pizza night. It was a time of profound fear, of gnawing uncertainty, of countless sleepless nights spent poring over spreadsheets, juggling bills, and offering each other whispered words of reassurance in the dark. During this incredibly difficult, vulnerable period for my family, Mrs. Eleanor Wheeler's subtle, insidious campaign of disdain seemed to intensify. Or perhaps I was just more acutely, painfully aware of it, my own emotional defenses worn thin by worry and exhaustion. I'd see her watching from her pristine living room window as I trudged home late from an extra library shift, her expression unreadable, but in my heightened state of anxiety, I imagined it filled with a smug, knowing satisfaction. The whispers in the neighborhood, I felt with a sickening certainty, now carried an extra layer of pitying condescension, undoubtedly fueled by her continued artful commentary. Poor Martha! I could almost hear them saying their words, echoing Eleanor's likely sentiments, trying so very hard. But things are clearly irrevocably falling apart for them. Such a shame. One wonders if they can even afford to stay on Maple Street much longer. I tried with every ounce of my being to hold my head high, to project an image of resilience, of quiet dignity when I encountered my neighbors. But inside, I was crumbling. Her quiet, persistent, and now seemingly triumphant negativity was an additional unwelcome and deeply cruel burden on my already overloaded shoulders. I felt profoundly alone, not just in my family's financial struggles, but in this strange, one-sided, and utterly baffling neighborhood Cold War. Why, I wondered, did she seem to take such satisfaction in my family's misfortune? What had I ever done to her to deserve such relentless, underhanded malice? And then, as if fate itself, with its penchant for dramatic irony, had decided to reshuffle the deck with a heavy, almost theatrical dose of cosmic justice, the Wheelers' own seemingly perfect, untouchable world began to spectacularly and very publicly unravel. The initial signs were much like my own troubles had been subtle. It started with hushed, concerned conversations I couldn't help but overhear at the local coffee shop, where I sometimes treated myself to a latte after a particularly grueling library shift. Then came more direct, though still somewhat guarded murmurs from other more sympathetic neighbors during school pickup or at the grocery store. David Wheeler, Eleanor's husband, a man who always seemed impeccably dressed in expensive suits, who drove a late-model luxury sedan, and who exuded an air of quiet, unshakable affluence, had suddenly catastrophically lost his high-powered executive job at a major financial institution downtown. The circumstances surrounding his job loss were initially murky, shrouded in a miasma of whispered rumors and speculative gossip. Some said it was due to a massive corporate scandal that was about to break in the financial news, a failed merger that had gone disastrously wrong, or perhaps just a brutal, no-notice round of executive downsizing in a volatile market. Whatever the precise cause, the effect on the Wheeler family was immediate, profound, and devastating. Their carefully constructed, meticulously maintained facade of upper-middle-class prosperity began to crack, then visibly crumble. The professional landscaping crew who had once arrived like clockwork every Tuesday to meticulously tend their award-winning rose bushes and perfectly manicured lawns stopped coming altogether. Their two expensive cars, a sleek black BMW and a large family-sized SUV, once always gleaming immaculately in their wide driveway, were seen less and less frequently, replaced eventually by a single older, much more modest sedan. The designer clothes Eleanor had always favored were replaced by more subdued, less ostentatious attire. Even their prize-winning golden retriever, usually so boisterously groomed, began to look a little unkempt. The whispers in the neighborhood intensified, no longer just speculative, but now tinged with a mixture of shocked disbelief and a certain grim, if unspoken, fascination. Rumors turned to the very real possibility of them losing their grand colonial home on Maple Street. Apparently, their affluent lifestyle had been heavily leveraged, precariously built, almost entirely on David's substantial six-figure income, with little in the way of a financial safety net, no significant savings to cushion such a devastating blow. I heard from Susan, who, despite her reservations about Eleanor's past behavior towards me, still maintained a reluctant, pitying sort of friendship with her, that the Wheelers were indeed facing foreclosure. The bank, after several months of missed mortgage payments, had issued a final demand notice. They were on the very brink of losing everything: their home, their status, their carefully curated image of effortless prosperity. They were, in a word, desperate. My initial private reaction, I am ashamed to admit, was a fleeting, bitter, and wholly uncharitable surge of something akin to vindication. A small, mean, and deeply buried voice whispered in the farthest recesses of my mind. So, Mrs. Perfect isn't so perfect after all, is she? Now she knows what it feels like to struggle to face uncertainty, to be judged, to be whispered about by the very neighbors she once held in such disdain. But that dark, unworthy feeling was quickly and thankfully overshadowed by a deeper, more compassionate, and ultimately more characteristic instinct. I saw Eleanor Wheeler in the aisle of the local discount grocery store a few days later, a place I rarely saw her as she usually frequented the upscale organic market across town. She looked utterly diminished. Her usually immaculate silver hair was slightly disheveled, pulled back in a severe, unflattering bun. Dark, hollow circles shadowed her pale blue eyes, which darted around nervously, as if afraid of being recognized. The proud, almost arrogant set of her shoulders, which had always seemed to convey a sense of effortless superiority, had slumped, making her appear smaller, more fragile. She was frantically, almost desperately comparing prices on generic store-brand canned goods, her hands trembling visibly as she clutched a near-empty, battered-looking shopping basket. When our eyes met accidentally across a pyramid of discounted tuna fish, she flinched, a look of raw, unadulterated panic and deep, mortifying shame flashing across her face before she quickly turned away, abandoning her meager basket mid-aisle and practically fleeing the store head down, shoulders hunched. In that unguarded moment of her palpable desperation, I didn't see the woman who had systematically, cruelly tried to undermine me, who had spread unkind and untrue rumors about my family, who had treated me and mine with such consistent, inexplicable disdain for years. Instead, I saw a wife terrified for her family's future, for their very survival. I saw a mother consumed by an overwhelming, crushing worry for her children, for their stability, for their well-being. I saw simply a fellow human being in profound, overwhelming, and very public pain. And in that precise moment, looking at her retreating, defeated figure, I understood something crucial, something that shifted my entire perspective. Eleanor Wheeler wasn't inherently a bad or evil person, not deep down in her soul. Her past cruelty towards me, her incessant need to belittle and judge others, likely stemmed not from true malice, but from her own deep-seated insecurities, her own unacknowledged fears, her own immense pressures, real or perceived, to maintain a certain flawless image, a certain unattainable standard of perfection within our affluent, often competitive suburban community. Perhaps my simple, unpretentious contentment with my own life, my genuine kindness towards others, my refusal to engage in the neighborhood status games had inadvertently been a mirror reflecting her own dissatisfactions, her own anxieties, her own carefully hidden vulnerabilities. Now, with her meticulously constructed world crumbling around her, her carefully maintained defenses were gone, leaving only raw, exposed, vulnerable humanity. And despite everything she had done to hurt me, to isolate me, to make my own difficult times even harder, my heart, perhaps foolishly, perhaps inexplicably, went out to her. I knew intimately what it felt like to be scared to be facing an uncertain financial future, to worry endlessly about my children's well-being. And I knew, with a sudden, startling, and almost divine clarity, that this was my opportunity. Not for revenge in the traditional bitter sense of the word. Not to gloat or to say, "I told you so," or to watch her suffer as she had once seemed to relish my own struggles, but for a different kind of reckoning. A chance to show her, and perhaps to show the entire neighborhood, and most importantly, to show myself the true meaning of strength of character, of grace, under unimaginable pressure. I didn't want to just stand by and do nothing to passively savor her misfortune, however much a darker part of me might have felt she deserved it. That wasn't who I was. That wasn't who I ever wanted to be. And so a plan, audacious, unconventional, and entirely anonymous, began to form in my mind, a plan that felt both terrifying and exhilaratingly right. I wouldn't offer her pity, which her tattered pride would undoubtedly reject with disdain. I wouldn't confront her with her past unkindness, which would only deepen her already profound shame and achieve nothing constructive. Instead, I decided I would help her. I would help her family. In a way she would never expect from a source she would never ever suspect. I wouldn't say a single word to her or to Tom or to anyone else on Maple Street. I would quietly, discreetly go to the Northwood Community Bank, the very bank that held their overdue mortgage, and I would find out exactly how much they were in arrears, exactly what sum was needed to halt the imminent foreclosure proceedings that Susan had whispered about with such horrified concern. It was, I knew, likely to be a significant sum, almost certainly more than I could comfortably afford. especially with our own family's finances still in a somewhat precarious, though thankfully recovering state. Tom had recently found a new stable architectural position, but it paid considerably less than his previous one, and we were still diligently working to rebuild our depleted savings. Helping the Wheelers would mean more sacrifices for my own family for a while at least. We would have to postpone the much-needed repairs to our aging roof, Emily's college fund contributions would have to be temporarily reduced, and Ben's dreams of a new top-of-the-line football helmet would have to wait. But the thought of using our hard-earned money, our emergency fund, that I'd painstakingly rebuilt after Tom's layoff to perform an act of such unexpected, unmerited grace to perhaps fundamentally change the toxic dynamic that had existed between our two families for so long, felt undeniably, compellingly right. It felt like the most powerful, most meaningful, most Martha thing I could possibly do. I wanted Eleanor Wheeler to see not through my words, which she would likely dismiss, but through an irrefutable anonymous act of profound generosity, that I was not the person she had so consistently, so cruelly tried to paint me as. I was simply a neighbor, a fellow human being, a mother. And in the grand, complicated tapestry of life, sometimes that was more than enough. The meticulous execution of my unconventional plan required a delicate touch, careful planning, and above all, absolute, impenetrable discretion. The following Monday morning, after Tom had left for his new job with a kiss and a promise to be home early, and Emily and Ben were safely on the school bus, their chatter and laughter fading down Maple Street, I drove not to the library for my part-time shift, but directly to the main branch of Northwood Community Bank. It was a grand, slightly intimidating building downtown with imposing marble columns and hushed, carpeted interiors. My heart was a nervous, insistent flutter against my ribs. This felt audacious, almost presumptuous meddling in the most private affairs of a family who had shown me nothing but disdain. What if the bank refused to accept a payment from an anonymous third party? What if my carefully constructed intentions were somehow misconstrued, my anonymity breached? I took a deep breath and walked purposefully towards the loan department. I spoke to a senior loan officer, a kind-faced matronly woman with wise eyes named Mrs. Gable. I vaguely and somewhat awkwardly explained that I was a concerned member of the local community, wishing to anonymously assist a family I knew was facing imminent foreclosure without naming the Wheelers directly, at first simply referring to them as a Maple Street family in dire straits. She listened patiently, her expression a mixture of professional caution and genuine human sympathy. There were, of course, strict privacy protocols she had to adhere to. Banks couldn't just discuss the private financial details of their clients with strangers no matter how well-intentioned. But as I gently, persistently explained the urgency of the situation, the devastating impact a foreclosure would have on the children involved, and my absolute, unwavering insistence on complete anonymity for the family in question and for myself as the benefactor, she seemed to soften. I hinted that I had a general idea of the amount overdue based on community whispers and my own understanding of local property values and mortgage rates. After a few discreet inquiries on her computer system and a brief hushed phone call to another department, Mrs. Gable confirmed with a sad nod that yes, they did indeed have a prominent local family, the Wheelers of Maple Street, in precisely that dire financial situation. The final demand notice, the one that preceded the formal initiation of foreclosure proceedings, had in fact been issued the previous week. They had only a matter of days left. The amount required to bring their delinquent mortgage completely current to pay off all outstanding fees and penalties and to effectively halt the foreclosure proceedings was substantial. It was, as I had feared, nearly the entirety of my painstakingly rebuilt emergency fund. For a fleeting, heart-stopping moment, I hesitated. My own children's faces flashed before my eyes. Was this truly wise? Was this fiscally responsible? Was I jeopardizing my own family's fragile security, our own hard-won recovery for a woman? A family who had consistently shown me nothing but coldness and contempt. Then I thought of Eleanor Wheeler's haunted, desperate face in the grocery store, the raw, unadulterated panic in her eyes as she fled. I thought of her two teenage children, Thomas and Olivia, innocent pawns in all of this, facing the unimaginable trauma of losing their home, their stability, their very sense of place in the world. And I thought with a clarity that transcended financial prudence of the kind of person I wanted to be, the kind of world I wanted to live, in the kind of example I wanted to set for my own Emily and Ben. The decision once made with that deeper, more resonant understanding felt irrevocable, almost preordained. I arranged for an anonymous cashier's check to be drawn for the full exact amount made payable directly to Northwood Community Bank, with a clear, legally binding stipulation that the funds were to be applied exclusively to the outstanding balance on the Wheeler family's mortgage account number such and such. I stressed repeatedly, emphatically to Mrs. Gable that my identity as the benefactor was to remain completely, unequivocally confidential. Under no circumstances were the Wheelers or anyone else to be informed of the source of these funds. Mrs. Gable, to her credit, handled the entire unusual transaction with utmost professionalism, discretion, and a warm, understanding smile that made me feel for the first time in a long while a sense of genuine human connection outside my immediate family. She personally oversaw the processing of the payment, provided me with a receipt for the cashier's check, which I immediately shredded upon returning to my car, and assured me with a heartfelt sincerity in her kind eyes that my anonymity would be rigorously protected. "What you're doing, Mrs. Evans," she'd whispered as I was leaving, "is a truly remarkable thing. The world needs more people like you." Walking out of the imposing bank building an hour later, my handbag significantly lighter, but my heart strangely, inexplicably buoyant, I felt a profound sense of peace wash over me, a quiet, deeply resonant satisfaction that had absolutely nothing to do with triumph or revenge or one-upmanship. It was the simple, unadulterated, and incredibly powerful feeling of having done something genuinely, unconditionally good, something unexpected. Something that might plant a tiny, resilient seed of kindness in a patch of ground where only bitterness and judgment had seemed to grow for so very long. I had no expectations of gratitude, no desire for recognition, no need for Eleanor Wheeler to ever know the truth of my involvement. My reward was the act itself, the quiet internal affirmation of my own deeply held values, the knowledge that I had in my own small, anonymous way chosen light over darkness. I drove home along the familiar sun-dappled streets of Maple Street, and for some reason, everything looked a little brighter, a little more hopeful, a little more filled with grace. A few days later, on a crisp, golden Saturday morning in early autumn, I was in my front yard, engaged in the therapeutic ritual of deadheading my late-season rose bushes when I saw her. Eleanor Wheeler. She was walking slowly, almost hesitantly, up my short driveway. This in itself was an event of monumental unusualness. In all the 5 long years we'd been neighbors, she had never once voluntarily approached my house, never initiated any form of contact beyond those curt, almost forced perfunctory greetings when we happened to pass on the sidewalk. Her face, as she drew nearer, was pale, her usually immaculate silver hair slightly disarrayed by the autumn breeze. Her expression was a complex, almost unreadable mixture of bewilderment, profound disbelief, and something else I couldn't quite decipher at first glance. Perhaps a dawning, fragile, and utterly terrifying hope. She stopped at the edge of my meticulously edged flower bed, her hands clasped tightly, almost painfully in front of her, twisting a small, delicate, lace-edged handkerchief over and over again. For a long, agonizingly silent moment, she just stood there, seemingly struggling to find the words, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond my shoulder on the cheerful yellow siding of my house. "Martha!" she finally said, her voice barely a whisper, so thin and reedy it was almost carried away by the rustling leaves. It was a stark, shocking contrast to the sharp, often judgmental, and always confident tones I had occasionally and unpleasantly overheard from her in the past. May I please speak with you for just a moment?" I carefully put down my pruning shears and removed my gardening gloves, a sense of cautious, almost reluctant anticipation fluttering within my chest. This was it. The moment of reckoning, perhaps, though not the kind I had ever envisioned. "Of course, Eleanor. Please, I replied, keeping my own voice neutral, gentle, deliberately unthreatening. Is, is everything all right? She took a deep, shaky, audible breath, her gaze still not quite meeting mine. I received a telephone call from Mr. Henderson at Northwood Community Bank yesterday afternoon, Martha. And then, an official letter arrived by courier this morning. She paused, swallowing hard. Our, our outstanding mortgage arrears, the full amount, they've been paid, cleared in their entirety. Her voice cracked on the last words. The bank officer said, he said an anonymous benefactor had stepped forward, a concerned member of the community. They wouldn't tell me who it was. They couldn't tell me, but I had this feeling, Martha. This overwhelming, insistent feeling that it might have been you. Her pale blue eyes, usually so cold, so distant, so appraising, were now swimming with unshed tears, and they finally directly searched mine with a raw, vulnerable, almost desperate intensity. I didn't confirm or deny her unspoken question immediately. I simply met her gaze, holding it steadily without judgment, without triumph, allowing the silence to stretch to hang in the crisp autumn air between us to let her own conclusions, her own dawning understanding settle. I just don't understand it, Martha. She continued, her voice trembling, cracking with a mixture of disbelief and a profound, burgeoning shame. After how I've behaved towards you, the things I've thought about you, the unkind things I might have said to others, why would you of all people do something so incredibly generous for us, for me? The shame in her voice was palpable now, a stark, painful contrast to her former arrogance, her ingrained sense of superiority. It was the sound of a carefully constructed worldview shattering. It was only then that I allowed a small, almost imperceptible, gentle smile to touch my lips. Eleanor, I said softly, my voice imbued with a quiet sincerity. Does it truly matter who it was that offered a helping hand? What truly matters doesn't. It is that your family is safe now that you won't lose your home, that your children can sleep soundly tonight without that terrible fear hanging over them. Sometimes Eleanor help arrives from the most unexpected of places. Sometimes people are capable of far more kindness, far more compassion than we might ever give them credit for, especially when we've only ever looked for their flaws. Tears began to stream down her pale cheeks. Then, not the dramatic, performative tears I might have once suspected her capable of, but genuine, silent, overwhelming tears of what looked like profound remorse, bewildered gratitude, and perhaps a dawning, painful self-awareness. But it was you, wasn't it, Martha? She whispered again, her gaze unwavering, this time fixed on mine with a heartbreaking intensity. I saw you in this discount grocery store the other day. I ran away. I was so ashamed. But the way you looked at me, it wasn't with pity or that awful smug satisfaction I probably deserved. It was just kind. So unbelievably kind. I've been such a fool, Martha. Such a blind, arrogant, judgmental fool for so very long. She took another hesitant step closer, her hands still twisting the damp handkerchief into a tight, tortured knot. I need to apologize to you, Martha, properly, for everything, for the whispers, for the coldness, for the snide remarks I know you must have overheard, for judging you so harshly, so unfairly for so many years. I have no excuse, none. I was unhappy, I think, deep down, insecure about my own life, about David's job, about everything, and I took it out on you, because your genuine warmth, your quiet competence, your seemingly effortless contentment with your life, it somehow made me feel inadequate, less than. It's a terrible, shameful thing to admit, Martha, but it's the honest truth. Her confession, so raw, so unexpected, so utterly devoid of her usual artifice, touched a part of me I thought had hardened against her long ago. The lingering bitterness I had unconsciously held onto the quiet, simmering resentment for years of her subtle but persistent unkindness began to dissipate like morning mist burning off in the warmth of a rising sun, replaced by a surprising, overwhelming wave of empathy. Eleanor. I said, my voice still gentle, but now laced with a newfound warmth of my own. I appreciate your honesty, more than you can possibly know. We all make mistakes, Eleanor. We all have moments or even periods in our lives that we're not proud of when we look back. What truly matters, I think, is what we learn from those mistakes, and more importantly, how we choose to move forward, how we choose to treat others from that point on. I didn't expect, nor did I need a profuse groveling apology. Her actions in coming to my home, her vulnerability, her tearful, heartfelt confession in that moment spoke far louder, far more sincerely than any carefully crafted, socially acceptable words of contrition ever could. I simply smiled again, a genuine, open smile this time, a smile that reached my eyes and said, "There's truly no need for thanks, Eleanor. Really. Just perhaps remember that kindness, even when it seems undeserved, can be an incredibly powerful transformative force. Sometimes the very best way to fight darkness in ourselves or in others is with an unexpected, undeserved light. We're neighbors, after all. And in this community on this street, neighbors are supposed to help each other. That's all this was. The change in Eleanor Wheeler, and consequently in the relationship between our two families, was not instantaneous, not a magical overnight transformation. Deep-seated habits of thought and behavior, years of ingrained coolness and subtle animosity do not vanish with a single emotional encounter, however profound. But it was nonetheless a remarkable and lasting shift, a slow, cautious, but steady thawing of a very long winter. After that tearful, transformative, and entirely unexpected conversation on my sun-dappled driveway, the iciness that had defined Eleanor's demeanor for 5 long years began, almost imperceptibly at first, to melt away. She started to offer tentative, almost shy smiles when we passed on the street during my morning walks with Buster, or when we encountered each other at the local library where I still worked my part-time shifts. Then came hesitant but genuine good mornings and eventually even brief, slightly awkward but undeniably friendly conversations about the weather or the state of our respective gardens. Her 2 teenage children, Thomas and Olivia, perhaps sensing the profound shift in their mother's attitude, or perhaps simply relieved by the lifting of the oppressive financial cloud that had hung over their home, even began to offer shy waves and mumbled hellos to Emily and Ben when they crossed paths on their way to the school bus stop. Slowly, cautiously, our two families began to interact in ways that would have been utterly unthinkable just a few months prior. It started with small, tentative gestures of goodwill. Eleanor, one sunny afternoon, brought over a plate of freshly baked lemon poppy seed muffins, a peace offering, I suspected, and a surprisingly delicious one at that. Tom, always the practical, helpful one, spent a Saturday morning helping David Wheeler, who it turned out was remarkably inept at household repairs, despite his former executive prowess, fix a persistently leaky faucet in their guest bathroom. David, in turn, offered Tom some surprisingly insightful career advice based on his own recent humbling experiences in the job market. We found ourselves more and more frequently chatting over the low fence that separated our backyards while I was tending my roses, and Eleanor was with a newfound, almost desperate enthusiasm trying to revive her own neglected flower beds. We shared gardening tips, complained good-naturedly about the voracious appetites of the local deer, and discussed the mundane everyday things: school events, rising grocery prices, the latest neighborhood news that form the quiet, unassuming fabric of genuine neighborly connection. The transformation in Eleanor herself was the most remarkable aspect of it all. The sharp, judgmental edge that had always characterized her pronouncements was gone, softened, replaced by a more thoughtful, considerate, and often surprisingly humorous demeanor. She started volunteering at the local food bank every Wednesday afternoon, something I later learned from Susan that she'd always secretly wanted to do but had felt too self-conscious, too constrained by her carefully maintained image of aloof perfection to pursue. She, even to my utter astonishment and the initial trepidation of some of the other members, joined my long-standing monthly book club, and to everyone's surprise, especially my own, she offered insightful, often deeply personal, and frequently witty contributions to our discussions. It was as if a heavy, invisible burden had been lifted from her shoulders, allowing her true, perhaps long-suppressed, kinder, more authentic self to finally cautiously emerge. The rest of the Maple Street neighborhood, a close-knit community where little went unnoticed for long, observed the gradual but undeniable change in Eleanor Wheeler and in the thawing relationship between the Evanses and the Wheelers, with a mixture of curiosity, surprise, and eventually a quiet, collective approval. The insidious whispers about me, the ones Eleanor had so skillfully seeded, gradually died down, withered on the vine from lack of nourishment, replaced by a new, more respectful, and perhaps slightly awestruck curiosity. People saw Eleanor Wheeler, once my most vocal if consistently subtle detractor, now treating me and my family with genuine warmth, undeniable friendliness, and a profound, almost reverent respect. They saw our two families spending time together, our children actually playing in each other's yards, Tom and David sharing a beer on the porch on a summer evening. My act of anonymous kindness, though I never spoke of it to anyone, not even to Tom in its full, unvarnished detail, I simply told him I'd found a way to help them discreetly, had somehow inexplicably rippled outwards. It had subtly but significantly shifted the social dynamics of our little corner of Maple Street. They began to see me perhaps for the very first time, not as the too perfect show-off or overly ambitious woman Eleanor in her unhappiness had once tried so hard to portray me as, but simply as Martha, a kind, resilient, principled, and fundamentally decent human being, a good neighbor, and sometimes that was more than enough to change hearts and minds. The true, undeniable culmination of this unexpected transformative journey, the moment that brought a profound and deeply satisfying sense of closure. Not just for me, but I think for Eleanor as well, and perhaps for our entire little community, occurred about a year later at our annual Maple Street end-of-summer block party. It was a warm, golden Saturday evening, the air filled with the tantalizing scent of barbecue smoke and freshly cut grass, the joyful sound of children's laughter echoing through the cul-de-sac, and the easy, relaxed camaraderie of neighbors sharing food stories and a sense of belonging. Tom and I were chatting animatedly with Susan and her husband Jim near the communal dessert table, which was laden with an impressive array of homemade pies, cakes, and cookies, when Eleanor Wheeler approached our small group. She held a small, elegantly handwritten card in her hand, and her demeanor, while still possessing a newfound quiet dignity, was tinged with a nervousness I hadn't seen in her for many months. She looked directly at me, her pale blue eyes now so often filled with a gentle warmth, rather than icy judgment, holding a depth of emotion that was both humbling and deeply moving. Martha Tom. She began, her voice a little shaky but clear and sincere, her gaze briefly including Susan and Jim before returning to mine. There's something I've wanted to say to do for a very long time now, and I felt it was important to do it properly, publicly, in front of everyone here on Maple Street who might have heard or believed otherwise about me in the past. A hush, a sudden expectant stillness fell over the small group gathered around us, and then seemed to ripple outwards as other nearby neighbors sensed something significant was about to occur. Eleanor took a deep, steadying breath, her hands holding the small card, trembling almost imperceptibly. Many of you know, she continued, her voice gaining strength, her gaze now sweeping slowly, deliberately across the curious upturned faces of our assembled neighbors, that for a very long time I was not a good neighbor to Martha Evans. I misjudged her character. I allowed my own insecurities and unhappiness to color my perceptions. I spread, or at least contributed to unkind and untrue assumptions about her and her family. I was, to put it bluntly, and to my everlasting shame, a terrible, judgmental, and deeply unfair neighbor to her. And I was wrong. So profoundly, unequivocally wrong. She turned directly to me, then, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, her voice thick with an emotion that felt utterly genuine, utterly heartfelt. Martha, I know you told me many months ago that no thanks were necessary for your extraordinary act of kindness. But I need to say this not just for you, but for me, for my own conscience. What you did for my family, for David, and for me, and for our children, when we were at our absolute lowest point, when we were facing the loss of everything. It wasn't just about the money, Martha. It was about the incredible, unexpected, and wholly undeserved grace you showed us. You showed us a kindness, a compassion that we hadn't earned, a compassion that I most certainly had never extended to you. You saved us, Martha, in more ways than one. You didn't just save our home. You saved. You saved a part of my soul, I think. And you taught me a lesson about humility, about generosity, about forgiveness, and about the kind of person, the kind of neighbor, the kind of human being I truly want to strive to be for the rest of my days. I will never, ever forget what you did. And I promise you, I will spend the rest of my time on this street in this community trying to be half the neighbor, half the woman you have always been. She then turned her gaze back to the assembled neighbors, her voice now strong, unwavering, filled with a newfound hard-won conviction. I just wanted all of you, my friends, my neighbors, to hear the truth from me directly. Martha Evans is without a doubt one of the kindest, most principled, most genuinely good human beings I have ever had the privilege to know, and I am deeply, profoundly, and eternally sorry for ever having suggested or implied or allowed anyone to believe otherwise. Tears welled in my own eyes, then blurring the faces of my neighbors, blurring Eleanor's earnest, tear-streaked face. I hadn't expected this public declaration, this heartfelt, humbling, and incredibly brave apology. It was far more than I had ever anticipated or needed. I reached out without thinking and took her trembling hand in mine. "Eleanor," I said softly, my own voice thick with emotion that means more to me than you can possibly imagine. Thank you. From the bottom of my heart. It wasn't about my needing her public apology for my own vindication, for my own sense of justice. I had found my peace with her actions long ago. In the moment, I chose kindness over bitterness. It was about witnessing her profound transformation, her extraordinary courage in admitting her past wrongs so openly, so honestly, before the very community whose opinions she had once so desperately tried to manipulate. It was about the healing, not just between our two families, but the potential for a deeper, more authentic healing within our wider neighborhood. Later that evening, as the block party wound down, as the last of the barbecue smoke drifted into the twilight sky and the fireflies blinked their enchanting intermittent Morse code in the deepening shadows, as the children, including a now inseparable quartet of Emily, Ben, Thomas, and Olivia, played one last exhilarating game of flashlight tag on the dew-kissed lawn, I sat with Tom on our familiar porch swing, a sense of profound, quiet peace settling over me like a warm, comforting blanket. I realized then that I had perhaps inadvertently taught my own children through consistent example, rather than overt lecture, one of life's most valuable, if often most difficult lessons, the incredible transformative power of forgiveness, the quiet, indomitable strength found in compassion, the true, enduring meaning of being a good neighbor, a good human being. I had shown them. I hoped that you don't fight bitterness with more bitterness. Darkness with more darkness, but with an unexpected, undeserved, and ultimately disarming act of grace. And that sometimes the sweetest, most lasting, most meaningful revenge is not to crush your enemy, not to exult in their downfall, but to somehow miraculously transform them, and in doing so, transform yourself and the small, precious world around you, even if it's just one quiet, unassuming street, one heart, one relationship at a time. The relationship between our two families, the Evanses and the Wheelers, continued to blossom into a genuine, supportive, and deeply cherished friendship. Eleanor, shedding the last vestiges of her former insecurity and aloofness, became one of my closest, most trusted confidants on Maple Street. We shared not just gardening tips and recipes anymore, but our hopes, our fears, our joys, and the everyday ups and downs of life and motherhood. When Tom faced another brief period of work uncertainty a few years later, David Wheeler, now comfortably back on his feet in a new, albeit less grandiose, but far more fulfilling career was the very first neighbor to offer practical help, valuable connections, and unwavering moral support. Our children, once separated by an invisible wall of parental animosity, became true friends, their laughter often echoing between our two now interconnected backyards. The old corrosive animosity was well and truly gone, replaced by a mutual respect, a shared history both painful and redemptive, and a deep, abiding understanding that transcended past hurts and misunderstandings. My story on Maple Street, the story of the feuding neighbors, became a quiet, almost legendary tale within our community, not of a dramatic takedown, not of a vengeful triumph, but of a different, far more potent kind of power, the enduring power of unwavering integrity, the quiet strength of radical, unexpected kindness, and the profound, life-altering truth that often the very best way to overcome negativity is not to mirror it, not to engage it on its own low level, but to consistently, steadfastly, and courageously overwhelm it with good. I hadn't set out all those years ago to teach Eleanor Wheeler or anyone else a lesson. I had only sought to live by my own deeply held values, to be true to my own character, even in the face of unwarranted unkindness. But in doing so, in choosing compassion over contempt, in choosing generosity over grievance, I had inadvertently shown everyone, including and perhaps most importantly myself, that true victory, the kind that nourishes the soul and strengthens the community, isn't about proving others wrong or exulting in their mistakes. It's about consistently, steadfastly choosing to do what is right, what is kind, what is fundamentally human even, and especially when it is the hardest, most counterintuitive path to take. And that, I realized with a deep and abiding sense of peace, was a revenge far sweeter, far more satisfying, and far more enduring than any act of petty retribution could ever possibly be.